All right. Well, thank you all for joining us this afternoon and or late evening, depending on where you are. I'm Michelle Savilich. If you're new to us and CIRCA, I think a lot of you guys are repeats. I see a bunch of names I recognize, but we've started the Center for Integrative Research and Conflict Archaeology to be that community for all of us that study conflict archaeology and are scattered around the world with not a lot of colleagues probably where we're located. So sometimes we don't have a chance to talk except at conferences. And I really want this place to be a spot where we can communicate, we can have these lectures, we can post stuff, resources on the website, do as many things as we can to kind of fill in the gaps between conference years and to help students coming into this field how to navigate it, because there's not many programs left and the few that are there slowly kind of phasing out. So if an undergrad comes and says, I want to do conflict archaeology, what do I do? I'm hoping we can serve as, the point person that they can come to us and we can say, oh, here, talk to this person, or here's some resources, or here's some opportunities. We just hired or brought on 2 newsletter editors, so that'll help me get the newsletter out much more regularly. Again, this is something we all are doing in our nights and weekends and our spare time, trying to cobble together and make it happen. So everybody that joins as a member, we really appreciate that membership. It keeps this running. It helps us get the web space that we need and this Google Meet that we can have. So that's a little bit about conflict archaeology. And I am very excited today for Helen's talk. She has a professional background in landscape design and is co-founder of Scape Design, a practice specializing in creating sustainable, low-maintenance gardens through tough Mediterranean climates. She co-designs show gardens worldwide that won numerous medals, including golds at Singapore, Philadelphia, Moscow, Japan, China, France, Sicily, and Chelsea. But she has a passion for history and particular formation of landscapes. So now she's combining her love of history with landscapes. She got an MA from the University of Sheffield, focusing on landscape archaeology and World War II landscapes. And right now she's in their final stages of her PhD. So we're very excited to get a sneak peek of what she's been working on. She has a fascinating background, so please go read the rest of her bio on our website at conflictarchaeology.org. And I will mute myself so you don't hear my kids in the background anymore, and I will turn it over to you, Helen. If everybody else could just mute yourselves, you're welcome to turn off your cameras too while she's talking. We'll do questions at the end, but if you thought of something you don't want to forget, feel free to use the chat box and you can type it and we'll circle back at the end of the talk. So with that, I'll turn it to you, Helen.
Thank you very much, Michelle. Let me just get screen sharing going, hopefully. Is that good? Can everyone see that?
You are good.
Okay, good to go. Well, thank you very much, Michelle. Thanks for organising the web series, Hard Act to Follow, with Joe and Ewan and Richard, whose excellent talks were over the last 3 months. As you said, I'm from a landscape background, but actually I kind of realised somewhere along the line that I wasn't that bothered about plants and prettiness, but what I was really fascinated by was landscape and how humans interact with it and the traces that we leave. So nowhere do we leave more trace than when we get involved in conflict. And then I got the chance to do a PhD looking at the landscape of the Somme and how that's regenerated. And so I moved here. So I actually live here now. And that's what I'm going to talk to you today about, how landscape remembers. So for those who don't know the Battle of the Somme, just to situate ourselves, so the Western Front in the First World War ranged from the North Sea in the north down to the Swiss border in the south, so 500 kilometers long and 10 to 15 kilometers wide. And there were 3 main areas of intense fighting. Obviously, there was fighting all the way along, so I'm not a military historian, but just to give you an idea. In the north, there was the Battle of Passchendaele and more than one Battle of Ypres as well. So that was one area up in the north in Belgium. In the south, there was the Battle of Verdun that was from February to November 1916. And then in the center, we have the Battle of the Somme, which was the summer of 1916. So 3 very different landscapes. Up in the north in Ypres, it's a very clayey, waterlogged soil. In the south, we've got quite a lot of difference in elevation. So we've got scree slopes. And then in the middle, in the Somme, we've got chalk plateau, which was brilliant for the tunneling and the digging the trenches and the mining. So that's where we're at. The Somme today So the Somme today looks like this. This is taken from my back garden, so it's a very agricultural landscape, and in between the landscape you can see the little intermittent woodlands. And the Somme at the time of just before the First World War would have looked very much like this without the wind turbines, obviously. Okay, we're moving. That's good. During the war, the landscape had obviously been completely devastated. This is due to the fact that at least 1,000 shells per metre squared were estimated to have been fired, which is a total of 1.5 million, and a third of those were duds. In terms of loss of life, there were 1.2 million deaths in the 5 months of the Battle of the Somme, and on the first day alone, which was the 1st of July 1916, 20,000 deaths occurred, and it still to this day remains the bloodiest day of British military history. But in terms of the landscape, in the 4 years of the war, scientific research has shown that the damage that was caused to those top layers of the soil is the equivalent to 10,000 years of natural erosion. So we've got this unique man-made landscape. We've all had lessons at school about the First World War. We're all familiar with the war poems. Most people know a relative or someone whose relatives died there. But I wanted to just show you that we're united with the landscape in the trauma that has been experienced. So in terms of post-war, what happened with the landscape was it was divided into zones. We had blue zones that were not touched at all, green, which was slightly touched, the yellow were damaged to some extent, and then the red zones were deemed completely destroyed, so 90% or more destroyed, and they weren't economically viable to put back into habitation or cultivation. So in Verdun, which was already experiencing rural depopulation pre-war, the red zones there were bought by the government and handed over to the National Forestry Commission. And so in Verdun today, it's mostly coniferous forest that was planted over the entire battlefield. And so it's really well preserved under those tree canopies, but it's quite uniform. Whereas in the Somme, because it was so agricultural, the locals decided that this was not acceptable, and they were very keen to get back to their farms and get back to making their land productive. So the red zones in the Somme went from 158,000 hectares in 1919 to just 530 in 1929. And it's the red zones that we're going to look at today, because those are the only centres now. Though when I showed you that picture of the landscape today, where it's gone back to agriculture, there are very few traces of the First World War left. But in these pockets of woodlands, there are traces. And unlike Verdun, the woodlands in the Somme are owned by a variety of different people. So some are privately owned by the farmers, some have been given over to memorials, and some are kind of somewhere in between. So when they were remaking the land back to production, there were financial incentives given for every metre squared that was laid over to agriculture, and there was also financial incentives for filling craters. So it was a bit of a rush job. The traces are still there under the soil, but you can't see them in the fields, but in the woodlands you can. So that's why I'm going to focus on the woodlands. So traditionally, the First World War has been approached through individual disciplines. So there are reams and reams of books that have been written about this from a military history perspective. But what I wanted to sort of demonstrate today, this is the framework I'm going to use for the presentation. So note the colours. On the human side, we've got the historical archival information, we've got archaeological remnants, and then we've got the cultural heritage side of things. And then on the top half, we've got the other than human. So anything that's environmental, botanical, geographical, and geological. But the thing that links them all together is the landscape. And that's what I want to try and demonstrate today by looking at all of these individually and how that relates to the war, and then a case study of one of the woodlands that I've been studying for my PhD to show you how those individual elements actually fit together. So from a historic archaeological perspective, there are lots and lots of maps available. There's lots of documentary evidence. There are oral testaments as well. The map that I've got here on the left is a carte d'état-majeur, which dates from 1866. And I wanted to show you this, because it was what was used for the basis for the trench maps that were then embellished when the troops had their own cartographers. But the little green outline you can see there is Thietval Wood, which is the one I'm going to use as a case study. So it's just to show you that these woodlands had been established pre-war, and as far back in some cases the 1700s. So they're what we could call ancient woodlands. Then in terms of material artifacts, so the iron harvest, every year 900 tons of unexploded ordnance comes to the surface. I took this picture literally 2 weeks ago, just up the road from where I live. So that gives you an idea. And obviously also there are the bomb disposal people that have to come and deal with this. And sadly, since 1946, 630 of them have died. So it's still very much, in a way, an active battlefield. And then obviously, as well as the artifacts, there are also soldiers' bodies that come to the surface. On the Thiepval Memorial, which is the large memorial to the missing, there are 72,000 names. About 50 soldiers per year come to the surface still now, 110 years after the conflict. So in terms of geography and geology, what happens to the soil? So in the diagram on the left, you've got at the top what a pre-war landscape would look like. So we've got a vegetation layer, we've got our nice A horizon with organic matter on top. Then we've got a B horizon that's pretty stable, and then the C horizon is the parent chalk material. Now, what happens when we have a shell that comes in and smashes through those horizons is the parent rock gets fissured, so the hydrology of the landscape is going to change. We get an accumulation of rubble at the bottom of the craters, and then we get a displacement of soil and rubble at the top, at the crater rims. And this phenomenon is called bombtubation, which was coined in the early 2000s by Joseph Hoopy, who's written lots of papers on this. And then in terms of the soil, on the right-hand side, this is taken from a place called Place Agaz in Verdun. So it's just to show you those horizons. And here, that top black layer is still so contaminated to this day. It's where they emptied out the chemical munitions and burnt the residue. This was so that they could recuperate the metal and send it back for production to the UK. But even now today, you can see nothing grows there. In terms of that vegetation, what does grow then? So as I said, in the Somme, it's very much gone back to agriculture. It's quite an industrial landscape. But then we've got these kind of little points of memory with the cemeteries that are dotted amongst this agricultural landscape. There are 370 something cemeteries in the Somme, Commonwealth War Grave ones. So it's a constant reminder that the whole landscape in itself is a memorial. And then once that bombtubation happens, it's also kind of like agriculture, because it's churning up the soil, it releases the seed bank, and you get these ruderal species that start to come back immediately post-war. And of course, now these species that we see as field flowers are very strongly associated with commemorations. So we've got the poppy for all the Commonwealth nations. The cornflower in the middle is what France uses, their national flower of remembrance. And at the bottom, we've got the forget-me-not, which is the German one. There's also something called obsidianal plants, which I think is a really cool word. And these are plants that are only where they are because of conflict. So some good examples are Cicericium montana, which came over with the American troops in 1917 and 1918 in the horse feed. And it's still found in pockets along the Western Front where the American troops were stationed. So then from a cultural heritage perspective, there's one landscape in the Somme at Newfoundland Park which preserved the trenches as a tourist sort of, not attraction is not the right word, but tourist commemoration. Otherwise, like I said, it's all agricultural. So we still get a lot of visitors coming either to visit the cemeteries as a pilgrimage or for the ceremonies in the form of commemoration. There's also the large monuments, and then we've got the educational aspects as well going on. So now moving on to my research. So I wanted to look, as I said, at the woodlands because the red zones are the woodlands. And I wanted to take in the whole of the battlefield as much as I could. So I started in the blue sector, which is the French sector in the south, and then working my way, kind of following the battle. The red sector in the north is the British sector. So I picked woodlands that were as close to the front line as possible, with the exception being Delville Wood in the middle here. You can see my mouse. And that was because I wanted to have woodlands that were representative of different management categories. So I chose 2 that had naturally regenerated, 2 that were sort of somewhere in between being naturally regenerated and quite heavily managed, and then 2 that were purposely planted for memorial purposes. So Delville Wood was my second memorial one, and that's why it's in, but it was still on the front line of the 14th of July action, so it still counts. So looking at the case study of Thiepval Wood, These are some of the archival sources that I found. So you can see the soldiers here right in the front line, dugouts. And then in the back, in the reserves line, because it's quite a big woodland, we've got the kind of service areas. So this is a cookhouse. And then this one here on the right-hand side is actually from the woodland looking out to the village, which is completely destroyed. So it gives you an idea of just the level of destruction that are going on in these woodlands. And then from a cartography point of view, again, still looking at the archives. So the trench map that is on the left here, you can see there's a massive network of trenches occurring in this woodland. And then the aerial photograph. So this curve here on the aerial photograph is that curve there on the woodland. This area of trenches is here. And as you can see, again, that the fact that it's on a chalk plateau means it's really visible from the air, those white lines. And then today, the woodland is thickly covered. It's got a dense canopy and it's a very healthy deciduous, mixed deciduous woodland. But if I overlay those trench lines onto the today's canopy, you can see that on the LiDAR, nearly all of those scars are still there under the canopy, which is why the fact that we've now got technology like LiDAR is so invaluable for modern conflict archaeology. Now, I couldn't explore every inch of all of those 6 woodlands because it was just going to take too long. So I chose an area in each that was about 200 meters by 200 meters, as close to the front line as I could. The blue line is the front line here. And then within those woodlands, I made 2 transects. So north, south, east, west, taking in some of those features. And then along those transects, that was going to be my kind of baseline to do soil sampling, tree surveys, and topography surveys as well. So this is one of the topography surveys using a total machine. So you can see we've got trenches, we've got craters, and then along those features, I took soil samples within the features and on the flatter land as well. And what's interesting is when we relate that back to bombturbation, that churning up of the soil, you can see here that top darker grey level is fairly consistent because this is pedogenesis that's occurred since the war. But then when we get down into the B horizons in this area here, it's completely mixed up. So despite the fact it looks fairly uniform on the surface, when we actually start looking down, we can see that the scars are still there, and that completely disturbed soil profile proves this. So then those soil samples, I wanted to see if there were what the elemental breakdown was, what was the geochemistry of these soil samples. So to dried them in the lab and ran them through XRF. And these are each of the boreholes within the Tietval Wood. So you can see this baseline here, the 0, is relative to FOREGS. So FOREGS is the European Geochemical Atlas, which gives us the recommended levels that we should have in the soil. And as you can see, consistently, we've got green, which is lead, orange, which is copper, and blue, which is arsenic, above those recommended levels, going up as far as 1,000% more than it should be in borehole number 1. So, and this was consistent across all of the woodlands. So where do those elements come from? Well, no great surprise with the amount of shells, 1.5 million that were fired. The fuses are made of copper and zinc. In the middle of the main shells, we've got all the shrapnel balls, which are made of lead, and the driving band are made of copper as well. And then when we come to the gas shells, the glass bottle in the middle contains arsenic. So it's kind of logical. We know where this contamination has come from, and the fact that those levels are so high proves that it's related to the war. So I just kind of wanted to get across the idea of soil is an artifact, despite the fact it's not made of metal and it's not in our hands, it's still there. And then I wanted to look at the patterns within the soil. So were these elements stored in a particular place within that soil profile? And so I started doing some statistical analysis, and lead, as you can see here, was concentrated here in the top part of the profile. And that's because it tends to bind to organic matter in clay, so it gets suspended in that top layer. Arsenic has got greater mobility and it tends to leach down through the profile a bit more. And so it was found in these middle profiles here. And then copper has an ability to move through the profile and it gets locked into the chalk parent material. So again, the soil is telling us a story about the elements that went into that, to the weapons. And then when I look at that across all 6 case studies, using this was, so I ran some manovers. I'm not going to bore you with the statistics because it was the biggest headache of the entire research. But across all woodlands, the elemental concentration was much higher in the trenches and the craters, which is kind of to be expected when you think, again, we've got accumulation coming down the sides of the craters and the trenches, but the statistics prove that. And what was really interesting, and I hadn't really thought about and hadn't expected, was that the way the woodlands were managed had a huge effect on the levels of contamination within them. So the memorial woodlands that were planted purposely for commemoration purposes had much higher levels of contamination than the naturally regenerated ones, and then the semi-curated ones were somewhere in between. So I wanted to see how that related to the vegetation. How's the vegetation responding to the this pollution that we've got in the soil left from the war? So in Tietval wood, it was predominantly Corylus avellana, which is hazel. And the hazel in this woodland had been coppiced. So for those of you that don't know forestry, that basically just means that you've got a multi-stemmed trunk and you keep cutting it down so that you get small stems that keep coming up. And it's a very traditional old way of managing woodlands, and then those stems would be used for fencing or firewood. So the Corylus avellana seems to be very happy in the highly contaminated areas. So up here and in the middle, it's not bothered by how contaminated the soil is. Whereas in the green circles here, this was Faga sylvatica, which is beech, and that seems to be happy on the edges of the trenches in all of the instances there. One thing that I found really interesting was when I was looking into this idea of the coppicing and the hazel, was because the trees are cut so regularly and you've got this kind of cycle going on, what it's doing is it's drawing the nutrients out of the soil, but it's also drawing some of the contamination out of the soil. So the woodlands where there was a high level of coppicing actually were less contaminated than the ones where there weren't. And then coming into the ground flora, so that map that I showed you from 1866, where we know it's been a woodland for several centuries, giving it ancient woodland status. Again, in the seed bank, this has started to show. So the ground cover are all what are known as ancient woodland indicators, these 4 plants here. So we've got dog mercury here, and then a couple of the different grasses, and then an orchid there. And then we've got organic matter. So the differing maintenance regimes affect the organic matter, which is going to increase that top layer of soil. And this is how they look. So naturally regenerated woodlands here, anything that falls down, any branches, any trunks are just left on the soil, and then they get turned into organic matter, and it just goes back into the system. And it's got lots of really lovely microphyta bacteria. So those were the least contaminated. In the middle, we've got the semi-curated woodlands. So you can see still quite natural looking trees, multi-stemmed, but the ground cover is a bit clearer. We've got a nice trench running down through the middle there. And then in the memorial replanted woodlands here, so we've got single stemmed trees, and we've got a very clear ground cover. And if you look, all of those trees in the memorial planted ones are of a similar age because they've now reached maturity. And this is going to be a real problem because there's no successional planting. So successional planting is when the mature tree dies and then you get a sapling that takes the relay and so on. So the naturally regenerated woods have kind of reached a stable ecosystem, whereas the memorial replanted ones are in really quite serious danger. And another tree species that was interesting was in the naturally regenerated woodlands, quite often poplars had come back, and in both of the semi-curated ones there had actually been planting in the 1950s of poplars. And again, researchers showed that poplars are quite natural phytoremedial trees, so again they have a capacity to clean the contamination, and that was proved in the woodlands that had poplars in had less contamination in the soil. Moving on to the heritage side of it, so Tietval wood it's a big woodland, and in the bottom half of the woodland it's left very natural, but in the top there is a reconstruction of the trenches. Now, Tietval wood was bought in 2004 by the Somme Association, which own the Ulster Tower. So for those of you that know the area, that's the memory of the 36th Ulster Regiment who fought in the Somme, and they left this woodland on the 1st of July and went out into the front line and had it was catastrophic. And so what's interesting was I wanted to explore how this idea of memory within these landscapes varied. So I did interviews for each woodland with two different people, one who was local and one who was either a guide or worked in the maintenance team, so had a different outlook on the woodland. And the guide was very much just about how important this woodland was to, as he says in the quote there, people back home. It's very it's visited on regular occasions by groups from Northern Ireland. And then contrast that to the owner of the woodland from straight after the war up until it was bought in 2004, whose memories are just, it was a playground. They ran around in the trenches. It had familial affiliation, the generational aspect of it, where they built houses in the middle, which still exist. So I thought that was really lovely to see this kind of like variation in memory and how we construct the narrative. And again, because it's now owned by the Ulster Tower, the narrative that you will hear if you go on one of their guided tour is just of that regiment. And they fought there for one day. The war in Thiepval Wood during the Battle of the Somme went on until nearly the end of September, and you won't hear anything about what happened from the 2nd of July up until the end of September if you go on that tour. So we're managing the woodlands from a vegetative point of view, and we're also managing the narratives that are being told within those woodlands. And how we construct memory tends to be, I think, in sort of circular motion. So I just wanted to use this example, which actually harks back quite nicely to you and what he was saying in his talk about the toy soldiers. So we've got people that come and they do field walking and they're looking for remnants of the war. And then they find loads and loads of shrapnel balls. They're all on the surface. It's those shrapnel balls that are causing that contamination that we've seen in the soil. But they're also being turned into badges and figurines that are available for sale in the visitor centres at Thiepval Memorial, for example. So it's kind of like this continuation of the violence of the war and the shrapnel balls in the soil causing the contamination and the destruction that's caused to the landscape. And then it kind of being circular, I can't even find the word, and then being turned into souvenirs for commemoration. And it's not just in terms of material artifacts that this is occurring, it's also happening with the vegetation. So Delville Wood, which is the South African National Memorial, this is a newspaper cutting with a kind of drawing of the Battle of Delville Wood. It was terrible. 3,200 soldiers went in, and over a 5-day period were absolutely slaughtered, and only 120 came out. And again, if you visit Delville Wood, that's the story that you will hear. We've got the museum here and the monument to the South Africans, and yet again the war went on for another 6 weeks. You won't hear that narrative. If you go to the Ulster Tower, the tour that I showed you in Thiepval Wood, you'll also hear about the Victoria Cross winners, so these kind of mythological heroes in soldiers. And again, this is recurring in the vegetation. So in Delville Wood, there's one tree that survived, which is a hornbeam, this one here, and it's known as the last tree. And people make a point of coming to visit it. And in the visitor centre, you can buy this postcard. So it's become kind of mythicized, this tree. And I can tell you that that postcard is not a hornbeam. So it's not actually that tree, but it's interesting how it's taken on this status. And actually, in one of my naturally regenerated woodlands, there was a hornbeam that was much more impressive, that had obviously survived the war as well. But because it's not open to the public and no one knows it's there, it doesn't get anywhere near the same recognition. So again, it's this kind of narratives that are being associated with people, trees and places. Oh, and just, yeah, the circularity thing again, sorry, I forgot that bit. So here, the alley of oaks that lead down to the monument in the South African woodland in Delville Wood, these acorns were taken from France by the Huguenots to South Africa in 1688 and planted. And then after the war, acorns from those trees in South Africa were then brought back and planted in this woodland here. But again, we've now got this problem where it's been, to try and maintain the design integrity of the memorial, the trees are now mature and they're starting to fall. So we're losing that aspect of how it was initially designed by Herbert Baker. So different trajectories for different management regimes. So 1918.0, everything was totally destroyed. In the 1920s, there was land clearance and crater trench filling across all of them. And then we start to see the difference. We've got the two natural woodland and the semi-curated woodlands start to regenerate on the same footprint as they were pre-war, but already we've got the monuments and the planting starting to happen in the other memorial woodlands. In the 1950s, these two, again, same trajectory, firewood, hunting, very much traditional use in the woodlands, whereas here in the memorial woodlands, pilgrims are starting to come. There was a big push at the 50th anniversary of the First World War, and then they've realised that the planting that they'd made originally planted in the memorial woodlands wasn't working because the soil was so contaminated. So they revised it and did this monoculture of beech trees, because beech trees are memorial trees. Whereas had they actually done their research and looked at things like poplars and coppicing, they would have been healing the soil. And then in the semi-curated woodlands in the 1980s, we get, and it's actually from the 50s onwards, but particularly more in the 1980s, commercial forestry starts to make a show, and then we get the trench reconstructions and the educational visits happening in the early 2000s. In the memorial woodlands, again, because of the centenary, roads were being widened, tourism was growing, visitor centre, and there was little succession happening in amongst the vegetation. So what does this all mean? So because the woodlands have different aims and different stakeholders, their trajectories are going to change, as I showed in the last one. But then in terms of landscape components, we've got those four disciplines that I showed you at the beginning. All of them have got soil and geomorphology. All of them have got vegetation. Not all of them have got heritage and monument, but that is a landscape component. And all of them are managed to a certain degree over time, whether it's just from hunting or firewood, or whether it is heavily managed. And then we start to mix the disciplines here in the conflict, legacies and constraints. So the safety and liability, for example, could be in the areas where you're going to have several tourists visiting, you're going to have to chop your trees down. If you've got unexploded ordnance, it has to be cleared much more quickly in an area where you're going to have tourists than in the naturally regenerated woodlands where it's just left on the surface. We've got contested meanings. Again, we're managing that narrative, whether it's in terms of vegetation, and we're saying, no, it has to be a static woodland because that's what memorial means, or whether it's the narrative that's being told in terms of the visitors that are going there. And then when we get to like what's happening today and what's going in the future, this is where it all mixes up completely. So the Commonwealth War Graves Commission that manage two of the woodlands are aware that they need to be more biodiverse. They're aware that potentially not all of the management strategies are working. And then there's this kind of idea of, well, in the natural regenerated woodlands, if it's not managed, are the scars going to disappear? And is that important? So why does this matter? So the landscape is going to outlive us all. It's got the scars, it's a living witness of what has happened in the past, but it's also a living legacy of what's going to happen in the future. And these two images are taken from the Ukraine, so from the Ministry of Defence's X account. So look at the similarities to 110 years ago. And at some point, hopefully soon, the war in Ukraine will end, and we need to make decisions about what we're going to do with that landscape. Are we going to plant it? If so, how are we going to plant it? How contaminated is the soil? Are we going to address that? Which parts are we going to keep? And what tales and narratives are we going to tell from heritage perspective, or the bits we do decide to keep? So I just wanted to get that across, that it's not just the past and what landscape can tell us about the past. It's what we can learn from the past that will inform what we can do with the landscape as a legacy for the future. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Helen. That was fascinating to think about the landscape as an artifact you can dissect, and then also as a remediation tool, something that gets overlooked quite a lot, I think. So if anyone has questions, feel free to unmute yourself, and I'll let Helen go ahead and take point on her questions. Getting some comments.
Helen, I have a quick question. Earlier on, you mentioned how some of the craters and trenches were sort of filled in. Where did that fill come from?
Yeah, I'm not muted anyway. So it was anything that was available. So in terms of, because they had to get it, it was all about speed. They wanted to get it back to production. So all of that ordnance and anything that was left lying around got chucked back into the trenches, and then anything that they could find locally, they would fill it in. And it's really interesting because I've done some geophysical surveys in the agricultural land that has just been given over to pasture rather than crop, and you can see completely the crenellation of the trenches. So it's all still there because it's been chucked so much metals in there that it's yeah.
Thank you.
Ewan's got his hand up.
Hi, Helen.
Hello.
I have to say, thank you so much. This was amazing. I knew it was going to be good, but you knocked it out of the park for me. So thank you so much. I actually, it brought back a lot of memories because I did my master's dissertation on the area around Dochu, just south of Tival. Like literally like a kilometer away. So I was like, I knew like the whole area that you were talking about really intimately. So I was so glad when that came up as the case study. I was like, oh, amazing. This is somewhere I really know. One thing that I was kind of conscious of really early on when you were talking about like the red zones. And I had heard that basically like I've never been to Verdun, but I've heard that there's kind of like a lot of the red zones still in existence and like the sort of destroyed villages left as they were sort of thing. But I knew, like you said, in the Somme area that a lot of things have been reconstructed. And one of the things that I noticed when I was like, and I was kind of hoping whether you'd be able to sort of see if you'd come across this as well, was when I was doing a lot of the kind of like reconstruction mapping of the landscape, what that area looks like today is very, very similar to the maps from the time. Like I found like they matched up really, really well, suspiciously well. And I was like, and I sort of had this thought process that maybe actually the landscape that is there now is like reconstructed. Like, you know, if you're going to rebuild Tival, for example, how are you going to rebuild it? Well, you need a map of what Tival looked like before you blew it to small pieces. And the fact that a lot of these areas around there pretty much exactly match the maps made me think, is the landscape we have now the map from 1918 or 1914 rather than the landscape from 1914? If you see what I mean, like there's sort of like that reconstruction has created sort of like a false landscape in a way, or false history of what it should have looked like, if you see what I mean. Like we think, oh, it hasn't changed because it looks exactly like the map. If you see, I mean, did you come across that kind of thing, or am I insane?
I think to a certain extent that is true, but I think it was a very conscious effort, like you said. You know, it was from a psychological perspective, it was no, we want our homes back. But there were the dommage de guerre, so it was like, you know, they were granted the insurance money to, you know, they could choose whether they wanted to reconstruct or not, and it was a personal choice that nearly all of them wanted to. When you said about Thiepval, I mean, yes and no, because it's much smaller than it was. There was a huge chateau there at the time of the war, which doesn't exist anymore. Yeah. And I think it is quite strange when you drive around this area and you do get that sense of like all the villages look the same, because of course they were all built in 1920 onwards. So yeah, I think you're right there. But it was a conscious effort, and I don't think it was a let's remap as it was before. I think it came more emotionally. I think it was the people that just wanted to, you know, forget. And then unfortunately 20 years later those new builds were occupied by the Second World War, so you know, it's kind of like this continuation of did that answer the question?
No, it does. Like I just to kind of something else that following on from that is the other thing I experienced in that area was like street names that are like still named after, like Ochi, for example, has a street name that is named after Campbell Trench. Like Campbell Avenue still exists as like a road. Yeah. In a way that like actually the sort of like almost the postal landscape of.
Oh, you bugged out there.
Because the street names have changed to match trenches that ran in that area. It's almost like the sort of like postal map of the area is conflict related now as well.
Yeah, and I think it's not just in trenches. I mean, you'll see there are a lot of street names named after regiments. And then you've got things like, I know just up the road in Guillemont, or Guillemont as the English say, there's Ernst Junger. So that was, again, you know, one of the authors that came through here from the German side, and there's a road named after him there. So yeah, it's very much the road names, not just in terms of the trenches, but also the regiments that fought there, the authors that came through. Yeah, it's everywhere. You can't miss it. Any other questions?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah. Yeah.
Hello, Helen.
Hi, Carl.
Yeah, nice to meet you. Yeah, good. That was superbly interesting, fascinating, you know. So,
Oh, good.
I mean, the geography of and the landscape around the Somme is just everything that makes the Somme so interesting. And just to add to what Ewan, is that your name?
Yeah.
You know, after the war, you know, what the landowners were looking to do, they encouraged the planting or natural replantation of the forests and the woodlands because it's an agricultural area. So those were important landscape markers for defining where the agricultural land started and finished. So that made real sense to get those woodland back on the map, if you want to call it that, because that defined where the landscape for the arable land was.
Yeah, and it's also because I've tried to find traces of, because it was struck me, I wanted to know, was there some law that was passed that said the woodlands have to follow the imprint of exactly where they were pre-war, and there's no trace of that. But I think it is also just because the woodlands tend to be on the areas where agriculture won't succeed, so they're slightly sloping, or they're, you know, and again, it kind of dates back to the fact that most of these are ancient woodlands, so they were used for hunting or providing firewood and fencing materials and so on and so forth.
Or I suppose owned by the chateau.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, what I was going to ask you though, Helen, is with regards to the growing of arable crops on the Somme landscape, is there a differential between areas for growing wheat or barley?
It's rotational.
Yields, you know?
It's rotational. This is something that I find really interesting, because when I've looked at the contamination that is in the soil, I know I'm looking at woodlands, which is the undisturbed soil, but you can't tell me that somewhere in that arable land there's not still quite high levels of contamination, and it's been under production since, you know, straight after the war. But no, in terms of crops, it's very much rotational. So one year it will be a wheat field, the next year it'll be potatoes, but there are probably 5 key crops that rotate, which is sugar beet, which was still huge at the time. In all the wartime maps you'll see sucrerie mentioned everywhere, wheat, rapeseed, what else is there, carrots, potatoes, but it's very much rotational.
I wonder how, like, their yields though compare to land that wasn't used during the First World War conflict.
Well, it's a difficult one, because there is also the argument that in terms of some of the things that come with war, it churns up the soil as a big plywood, but also the nitrogen and stuff that gets added from conflict's action feeds the soil, and so do, sadly, the dead bodies that are in it and the dead horses and so on and so forth. So there's this kind of, like, you know, organic matter that's going back into the soil that actually makes it quite fertile.
Yeah, adds a nice bit of humus. Yeah, okay, nice. And what about your garden? living there.
Don't ask me about my garden.
Yeah, but I wonder if there's some plants that grow better or some that don't grow at all and such like.
There are certainly areas that you'll see anywhere and around here where you can still see the chalk patches on the surface when it's being, so you can see there are areas where there was more intense fighting where the chalk is near the surface. I don't know if you've ever been up to Hawthorne Ridge.
I know Rick.
Right, okay, so you know the massive crater, and then you've got all the spoil and stuff, and you can still see the chalky areas. And then again, you know, the aerial photographs show you where the trenches are still now. You can pick them out. And now with LiDAR, it's incredible what you can see.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much. And I'll look forward to seeing you on the 110th. I'll be there.
Cool. See you then.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thanks for this evening.
Pleasure.
I'm looking forward to referencing your PhD. So
Got to finish it first, Ewan.
Does anybody else have any questions or comments, thoughts they want to share? Got another thank you comment. Thanks for joining us, Sean. All right. Well, I guess if that's it, we can let you, I know it's very, very late where you are, so we can let you go. But thank you so much, Helen. It was absolutely fascinating. And I will edit this down and get it up on the website. And as I say, Helen, if you want to try to pop me your PowerPoint, maybe I can put the voice over a new slide.
Yeah, I'm really sorry about the whole screen sharing thing. I don't know what happened there.
It's fine. And it's a good point. In the future, we'll send me a copy as a backup, and then I can always, you can just say next slide and I'll have it ready just in case too. So it's a learning experience for all of us. We're figuring it out as we go. So thank you all for bearing with us. And our next talk, I forgot to mention at the beginning, is going to be May 27th. We have Matt Kalos doing Objects of Memory, a longitudinal approach to conflict archaeology. So same place, same time, 3:30 our East Coast US time and 8:30, 9:30 p.m. depending on where you are in the UK or France. I've got the time zones finally worked out, and by the time we figure it out, it'll be changing again, I'm sure. But thank you all for joining us, and please, follow along on our Facebook page, and we're gonna start putting out some new newsletters here soon. So make sure you're a member and getting all of our information. So conflictarchaeology.org. Oh, there was a hand raised. Go ahead, Dad. Maybe not. Maybe
Sorry,
the
that
wrong button.
was a butt call.
Oh, okay. That's what I figured. So, all right.
Cool.
Well, thank
you very much, everyone.
All right. Have a good night. Bye.
Bye-bye.